10 years, and it's really a great honor to be here, sharing this panel with an extraordinarily distinguished group of guests, journalists, working journalists, professors of journalism from Morocco and from abroad. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the Moroccan press, just to orient you, especially those of you who are not from Morocco. Those of you from Morocco, this will probably be obvious, but I thought it would help. And then we will turn the floor over to each of the speakers who will be discussing various aspects of the journalism and the press. As you probably already know, the Moroccan press landscape has undergone a radical transformation over the last 10 years, really. It's a very new phenomenon. The concept of an independent press, meaning not a press that isn't related to a political party, has only existed in Morocco since about 1991, and there has been an opening of press freedom only really in the last 10 years. It really started in 1997. So the first thing to remember is when you look at the Moroccan press landscape, this is a completely new phenomenon, and I would argue a revolution in the way press operates here and in the degree and flexibility that they have to operate here. The print media now, and this is a major change from just 10 years ago, is dominated by literally hundreds of national and regional independent newspapers and magazines, while as only 20 years ago there was only partisan newspapers and magazines. Now there are all mostly independent, and they're everywhere. Every small town and city has its own newspapers. Some of them are online, some of them are in print, but it's remarkable in a country like this that you see so many newspapers. The other major change, which is important to note, is, and this is even newer, the complete transformation of the broadcast media landscape. I arrived here in 2006. There were no private television stations in Morocco, and there was one could call it private radio station. Now there's one private radio station, and I'm only talking about domestically, obviously, because lots of private television radio come from abroad, but there's one private television station, but the more important development is that there are 10 private radio stations, and this June I hear that that will be expanded perhaps by another group of around 10. And that has had an enormous impact on the ability, particularly of the youth, because a lot of these radio stations are focused specifically on the youth, and they have shows for the youth, talk shows and call-in shows, a concept which just didn't exist in Morocco even as recently as when I arrived 2 years ago. As a result of these transformations, Morocco is generally acknowledged as being on the vanguard of press freedom in the Arab world. There are few, if any, countries in the Arab world that look like Morocco, that have the degree of freedom that Morocco has, although those have limits, which I'll get to in a moment. The first thing I want to mention is that the vast majority of Moroccans get their news from the broadcast media, and that limits the degree to which they're getting completely independent opinions. As I mentioned already, Moroccan television is still largely government-owned, and so you don't see a huge amount of direct criticism of political policies, and you see very little investigative reporting. They do other good things, very good documentaries, but the kind of hardcore investigative reporting you would see on a Western television station is largely absent here. The other important point to note is that the far and away the most popular television station in Morocco is Al Jazeera. Nothing even comes close, and every poll indicates that. So when you're looking at what influences Moroccans in terms of what they want to watch, it isn't even coming from Morocco, it's coming from somewhere else. And this is particularly true because Al Jazeera, about a year and a half ago, launched a hour-long news hour specifically focused on North Africa, which broadcasts at 10 o'clock local time. And so Al Jazeera is making a huge effort to focus more on the issues of North Africa, and that has attracted more North African viewers. The radio, because it is much more open, much more independent, you're starting to see a lot more aggressive aggressive journalism coming from the radio. It's still mild when you compare it with the print media, but it's nevertheless an important development. And you're hearing, particularly on social issues, you're hearing a lot of interesting discussion going on, which is youth-oriented on Moroccan radio stations about very controversial issues that you would not have heard just a few years ago. On the press side, As I mentioned, you have a huge and growing independent press, which is fiercely independent and is very, very critical of practically every aspect of politics, society, economics, with some minor, not minor, important, but small limitations. But the audience of the print press is extremely limited. The daily press run of every newspaper in Morocco is perhaps 300,000 copies. If you compare that in Algeria, for example, which has roughly the same population of Morocco, there is a single newspaper that prints 500,000 copies every day. And I'm talking about dozens of daily, weekly, and monthly newspapers that all told print maybe 300,000 copies. One of the major factors limiting the print press is literacy, which is very, very high in Morocco, much higher than in comparison with its North African neighbors. But still, even with that high level of illiteracy, you have probably 10 million adult readers and only 300,000 copies being sold a day. So that demonstrates the degree to which the print press is, its influence is limited. Nevertheless, you have, as I mentioned, a very aggressive and growing independent press. You have titles that are new, like El Masak, which was only created about a year and a half ago, Talkel and Le Journal, which are a little bit older, that have made reputations for being very, very aggressive, and they have gotten themselves in trouble as a result, which I'll mention in a moment. There's still a partisan press here. I speak to their directors on a regular basis, and there is an interesting question as to whether they have a future. They need to compete in an increasingly complicated environment and market, and I think it's very difficult. Most of them sell very, very few. There's a couple of exceptions, but they're definitely struggling. And I wanted to mention briefly also the fact that the regional media in Morocco, the regional press, press based in smaller cities outside Rabat and Casablanca, plays an extremely important role in grassroots democracy. And this is an area where I think youth are definitely playing a major role in Morocco right now in reporting on, uncovering local level concerns, whether it's corruption, whether it's basic problems like whatever it can be, education, traffic. But you have these small newspapers, you have them online, you have them in print, that are doing a very good job of keeping their local leaders honest. In some ways, better than what's happening at the national level, because I think they're having perhaps more influence. It's also important to just mention, although I will not go into any detail because it's the subject of your next panel, the enormous growth of the new media technologies and citizen journalism in Morocco. And this is an area where the young are especially important, obviously. The vast majority of young Moroccans do not get their news from any of the major news outlets. They get their news from the internet. And internet penetration in Morocco is very high in comparison with its education level and with its literacy level. Sorry, education and income level. There's a huge number of cyber cafes, as you probably know, and so it's actually pretty easy and pretty cheap for young Moroccans to get access regularly to the internet. I'm going to conclude with what I see are the major challenges to the Moroccan media landscape right now, and it's very easily summed up in two words, which are freedom and responsibility. And the need to balance out those two issues, I think, is the most important issue that Morocco faces. On the freedom issue, the laws in Morocco are still fairly restrictive, even if they're not widely applied. The press code has penalties for a very large number of cases that can involve prison sentences for journalists. That has not been applied recently, but it's there, and it represents a clear break for journalists that want to be aggressive and independent. There are overt red lines that everybody knows, and they're the reporting on the royal family and the king in his private capacity, reporting on Islam, and reporting on the territorial integrity of Morocco, which refers to the Western Sahara issue. And although journalists do report on all three of those issues in certain ways, those are